The prairie held its breath beneath the setting sun. Wind moved across the grass like a prayer half-remembered, carrying dust and silence and the scent of sage. A woman knelt beside a shallow grave at the edge of a dried riverbed. She was 20 years old, Maya Redbird, slight as a reed, her hair long and dark as spilled ink. The turquoise pendant at her throat caught the dying light. Before her lay the small mound of earth where she had buried her husband that afternoon. He had been kind, sickly, and too young to die. She had dug until her hands bled because there was no one else left to do it. For a long time she did not move. The desert sky shifted to rose and purple, and somewhere an owl called. Her lips trembled with words that did not come. Then, far off, she saw the thin curl of smoke, gray against the amber horizon. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Or one person, perhaps, if she was lucky. Her heart hesitated between fear and need. Still, she rose, brushed the dirt from her dress, and began walking toward it. Her footsteps carried her past the last traces of her old life. The wind played with the hem of her buckskin dress, whispering like an old friend she no longer understood. The sun dipped lower, and with every step the air grew colder. She pressed a hand to the turquoise pendant, his gift, and whispered, "Stay with me just a little longer." By the time she reached the cabin, night had come. The little house stood against the slope of a ridge, sturdy but lonely, its chimney breathing smoke into the stars. Light spilled through the window, orange, trembling, alive. She knocked once, soft, unsure, and waited. Inside came the scrape of boots, the low creak of floorboards, and then the door opened. Caleb Boone, 30 years old, filled the doorway like a mountain. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his beard rough as bark and his eyes the color of storm clouds. The fire behind him made his outline glow like a sentinel made of dust. For a long moment he simply looked at her, saying nothing. She felt small beneath that gaze, and yet safe in it too. "I lost my husband today," she said quietly. "Can I stay one night in your cabin?" The words fell heavy in the cold air. Caleb's jaw worked, but he said nothing at first. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside and gestured her in. The cabin smelled of pine resin and tobacco. A fire hissed in the stone hearth. She stood near it, hands trembling, while he poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. Her reflection wavered in the surface of the cup, eyes red from crying, face dust-streaked but still proud. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded again, the kind of man who let silence speak. When she tried to sit, her knees buckled. He caught her elbow before she could fall. His hands were rough but careful, as if afraid she might shatter. For a breath too long, neither moved. Then she pulled away gently, murmured an apology, and sat near the fire. He retreated to the far side of the room, leaned against the wall, and watched her in quiet. Outside, wind clawed at the shutters. Inside, the only sound was the fire's slow breathing. She felt the weight of his gaze but not its judgment. He, too, carried loneliness like a wound stitched into the heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough-edged. "You got far to go?" She shook her head. "Nowhere left." The conversation ended there. But in that silence, something began, a small, uncertain tether between two souls too tired to call it hope. She slept on a bedroll near the hearth. Sometime in the night she woke to the sound of thunder in the distance. For a moment she did not remember where she was. The scent of pine, the glow of firelight, and the steady rhythm of his breathing in the corner brought her back. She closed her eyes again, whispering a thank you to no one in particular. Morning came with a gold wash of light through the cracks in the shutters. She stepped outside to find him already working the corral fence. The air was cold enough to bite. Without a word she picked up a hammer and helped him straighten a post. He stared, half amused, but said nothing. She worked until sweat dampened her brow. When he offered coffee afterward, she accepted it with both hands. It tasted bitter and grounding. Over the next days, small things filled the silence. Her mending his torn shirt, him leaving extra firewood near her bed, her laughter, soft, startled, when he showed her how to ride his old mare, Dusty. The laughter seemed to startle him too. It had been years since his cabin had heard such a sound. He found himself watching her as she brushed her hair outside at dusk, the long strands catching the light like black silk. Curiosity bloomed in him, unwanted yet undeniable. What kind of courage did it take to bury love and still face the sunrise? They spoke in fragments. She told him her husband had fallen ill weeks ago on their way to Silver Creek to find a healer. She had carried him as far as she could before he slipped away. Caleb didn't answer. He knew better than to chase grief with words. He only nodded, his eyes dark with memory. Once, he'd had a fiancée, long buried now, taken by fever and small-town superstition. People still whispered that he'd cursed God after she died, that his silence was punishment. He let them whisper. He'd made peace with ghosts long ago. But the world beyond the ridge hadn't forgotten him. It hadn't forgotten to judge either. Word reached Dry Gulch that a native widow was living in Caleb Boone's cabin. Gossip bloomed like weeds. One afternoon a preacher and 2 ranchers rode up to his door, faces hard with righteousness. Maya was tending the fire when she heard them. "Boone," the preacher called, "folks are sayin' you're harborin' a heathen woman. Ain't right. Not after what the good book says." Caleb stepped outside, his shadow falling over them. "You rode all this way to quote scripture? To remind you what's decent," one rancher spat. "You keepin' her here, you'll ruin your name." "My name's already ruined," Caleb said, his voice flat as a gun barrel. He shut the door before they could answer. Through the window, Maya watched him lean against the wall, eyes closed. When he opened them again, they met hers. Something unspoken passed between them, something like protection, like belonging. That night she couldn't sleep. The firelight flickered across his face where he sat carving a piece of cedar. She whispered, "You shouldn't have angered them." "They were already angry," he said simply. "At the world. At anyone who don't fit their picture." She smiled faintly. "And do you fit theirs?" He shook his head. "Never have." The silence after that was soft, companionable. When thunder rolled across the plains, he moved closer to feed the fire. His hand brushed hers by accident. Neither pulled away. The next day, he rode into town for supplies. He came back at dusk to find the cabin door hanging open. The floor was scattered with broken wood carvings. Maya sat in the corner, her palm bleeding, eyes hollow. 2 men from Dry Gulch had come while he was gone, spitting words like stones, calling her witch, savage, worse. They had shoved her to the floor and left laughing. Caleb said nothing. He just turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into town. When he returned, night had swallowed the sky. His knuckles were raw, a thin cut above his brow. He didn't speak of what he'd done, and she didn't ask. Instead, she cleaned his wound with a damp cloth, her fingers trembling. He caught her wrist before she could pull away. "You don't owe me thanks," he murmured. She looked at him then, really looked, the weariness, the gentleness beneath it. "And you don't owe me pity." "I don't," he said. "I owe you peace." The storm outside broke open, rain hissing against the roof like applause. Inside, their hands stayed linked a moment longer than decency allowed. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. The space between them felt alive, fragile as glass. When dawn came, the world was rinsed clean. The prairie glittered with dew. Caleb sat on the porch steps, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something to end or begin. Maya joined him, her hair loose, the turquoise pendant shining softly. He turned to her and said, almost to himself, "People talk no matter what we do. Let them talk about something true." Before she could answer, he saddled his horse and rode toward town again. She waited, uncertain, heart drumming. When he returned an hour later, he wasn't alone. Preacher Dalton rode beside him, hat in hand, shame heavy on his face. Under the wide cottonwood behind the cabin, they stood together as the preacher cleared his throat. The sunlight fell in golden threads between the leaves. Caleb's voice was steady when he said his vows. Maya's was softer but no less sure. There was no ring of gold, only the silver band he'd worn from his father and the red ribbon she tied around his wrist, the symbol of her people's promise. The preacher spoke the words, awkward, grudging, but true enough, and when Caleb leaned down to kiss her, the world seemed to pause. Wind rippled through the grass, the air sweet with rain. Even the birds went quiet, as if watching. That night they danced barefoot beside the fire. He hummed an old tune, and she followed his steps until laughter filled the cabin again. When she finally rested her head against his chest, he whispered, "You're safe now." "Safe," she repeated, tasting the word like something she'd forgotten. Then, after a pause, "Maybe love isn't something you find. Maybe it's something that stays after everything else leaves." He smiled. "Then let's stay." Years later, when the prairie had grayed with age, Caleb would sit by that same fire and remember the night she first knocked on his door. He would tell their children how courage sometimes arrives wearing grief, and how kindness can build a home stronger than timber. He would tell them that the West was more than dust and danger, it was where broken souls found new names for love. And if you listened close enough, standing on that same ridge as the sun went down, you might still hear his voice carried by the wind. Love doesn't come roaring like thunder, it would whisper. It comes quiet like footsteps in the dust, asking only for a place to stay.